there's two people in this world that I think whenever you know a film is theirs, and I think it's Spielberg and it's Scorsese, and Nolan's obviously up there, but there's a way that Scorsese moves a camera, and I think Killers of the Flower Moon is just filled with these moments where you're just like, no one can move a camera like Scorsese does, and like you're just in that moment. You're either going through a crowd of people or you're panning around to a vista. There's something that Scorsese does that is just unapologetically his. Hello and welcome to the movie podcast review of Killers of the Flower Moon. My name is Daniel. I am one of your hosts today, and joining alongside me to review our first Martin Scorsese film in the movie podcast history in a long time. I mean, we had The Irishman, but that was just Shahbaz and I. So now it's the three of us, first time reviewing a Scorsese film. Well, I already said his name. Shahbaz, how you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. I was going to say the true Irishmen are the ones that reviewed The Irishman, as I recall.
I think that's how it works. Also joining us today on this review of Killers of the Flower Moon, it's Anthony. Hi, Anthony.
I will never watch The Irishman.
What? Why? What is your vendetta against the movie?
You've had so long, man, to watch it.
Every time I hear someone say, it's 3 hours long, I'm like, oh, I don't want to watch.
Have you never seen a Martin Scorsese film before? They've never been short.
Also, the movie that we're watching today is longer than The Irishman.
Was, yes.
But we're going to talk all about it. Of course, I want to say thank you to our friends at Apple TV Plus for inviting us to watch this film. It was a very fun screening because we got to reconnect with a lot of people that we haven't seen in a while, but also because it's always fun when we get to watch a movie that we know is going to be released on a streamer later on. I mean, the majority of people down the road will watch this at their homes, but we got to watch it on a big screen, and I think it really was a very impactful one to watch on the big screen. Of course, Killers of the Flower Moon is going to be releasing wide in theaters on October 20th. Apple is partnering with Paramount Pictures for the theatrical release of the film, and then it will be coming to Apple TV Plus at a later date. And you already know that this film is starring Leonardo DiCaprio, Robert De Niro, Lily Gladstone, with Jesse Plemons, Tantoo Cardinal, John Lithgow, and Brendan Fraser. There is a stacked cast in this film. And like we said at the top of the show, this is a longer film. So we're going to dive into everything and more the Killers of the Flower Moon has to offer. But before we do that, this is the movie podcast. You can catch brand new episodes all throughout the week with new interviews, reviews, and discussions on all the latest movies and series. We've had some really cool stuff going on the last month between TIFF, between LA with Spider-Man. Last week, we were in Montreal doing some cool Assassin's Creed stuff. So there's a lot of cool stuff happening on the movie podcast. So if you want to stay up to date with everything that we have going on, make sure you're following us on all social media platforms at the movie podcast. That's Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Letterboxd. And make sure you join our Discord. We're having some great conversations in there. And if you want to talk about this very movie, we're going to have a room opened up so we could talk all about it. So make sure you join. We have some great conversations. I love that we're having, even to this day, Oppenheimer, we're still having conversations going on in there.
Longest running spoiler room at the moment. I mean, it's just changing the name to the Oppenheimer podcast at this point.
I feel like that's appropriate, and I'm sure Oppenheimer is going to come up in this review. But if you are watching this on YouTube, please like, subscribe, leave a comment below. Let us know your favorite Scorsese film. Let us know what you think of Killers of the Flower Moon, or if you're planning on watching it in theaters or going away for the home release. There's lots to look forward to. Also, you may notice when you've pressed play on this episode that you may have gone some ads. Maybe there'll be some ads midway throughout the movie podcast. I mean, this is all, part of a new wave of what we're doing to keep the lights on, to keep our show growing. And if you don't like the ads, let us know. Obviously, it is a balancing act. We're figuring out where to place them, how they're going to come in. But if there is going to be a free, a ad-free version of the movie podcast very, very soon. So if you prefer to pay and not have any ads interrupt your show, well, that option is coming soon, so stay tuned for that. But like I said, thank you to our friends at Apple TV Plus for inviting us to watch this film. It's going to be releasing on October 20th. And if you want to know a little bit more about the film, at the turn of the 20th century, oil brought a fortune to the Osage Nation, who became some of the richest people in the world overnight. The wealth of these Native Americans immediately attracted white interlopers who manipulated, extorted, and stole as much Osage money as they could before resorting to murder. So, Lots to unpack here. Like we said, the movie is 3 hours and 26 minutes long. The longest film that we have watched this year. Maybe this will be the longest review of the year. We'll see. But Jay's going to give you his first reaction.
This is the year of the 3-hour films. It's crazy how so quickly all of a sudden, post-COVID, we went into an era of just how long can we make this movie? And some have been hits, some have really, like you mentioned before, Daniel, some movies like Oppenheimer have really utilized that 3 hours. And some other movies, maybe, they didn't need that length. Killers of the Flower Moon is a very interesting film because I never felt bored as much during it. There's definitely some slow pace moments in this movie, but I felt like whatever this movie kind of gave me, I was very interested and invested in. And that's also because I didn't know too much about this story. I didn't know too much about the Osage Nation. I didn't know too much about the oil that they had discovered and also what was kind of happening. I had assumed based on the trailers that it was just about murders happening within that community, which we've seen many times before in media and in movies and a lot of other shows out there. So I was thinking, cool, maybe we're going into that kind of a story here. So I was very surprised to see such a film about people who are typically marginalized, and now all of a sudden they are the wealthiest people and they're always got a target on their back. Martin Scorsese, he knows exactly what he's doing. He's in the absolute top notch of his game as always. He's one of the best directors out there. There's no questioning that. No one will ever refute that statement. And he's coming in this movie making it absolutely beautiful and brilliant. I really, really enjoyed Killers of the Flower Moon, mostly because the performances and the story. There are some issues within the film that I know we will kind of dive deeper into. A lot of them do deal with the fact of the length of this film. It is a very Martin Scorsese thing to do where there's maybe just way too much kind of happening in it. But this movie is completely driven by the performances. We have performances that are going to absolutely blow you away, like Lily Gladstone, who's playing Molly Burkhart. It's the subtlety in her performance in this entire movie that really kept me so engaged because she has a level of unpredictability that kind of carries in the way that she walks and the way that she talks. But there's also this immediate demanding demeanor of her as well, where you're like, I don't want to mess with you. You look like you would school me in an argument or a conversation. And then you have Robert De Niro, who is so good in this movie. I feel like it's been quite a long time since I've seen a performance from Robert De Niro where he absolutely captivates me. Sometimes I feel like he just kind of like, I'm the old angry grandpa, or I'm just kind of fed up in this movie, or I don't want to do this role. And to see him really put in that effort in this movie was fantastic. There's other performances in the movie that come in a little bit later, like Jesse Plemons and Brendan Fraser. And then we have obviously Leonardo DiCaprio, who I think I love Leonardo DiCaprio. I think that, when the movies that he does is great, but I feel like his performances as of late have become very predictable. Like you kind of know exactly what cadence he's going to use, how he's going to be talking, the way he's going to deliver the line. And because of that, his performance always feels kind of safe. I think the set design, I think the way that it's shot looks beautiful. We've talked a lot about streamers and the way that their movies appear sometimes, and they have this look to it that's like, okay, you can tell this is a movie made for streaming. Killers of the Flower Moon looks like a movie that's meant to be in theaters. It looks like a movie that's meant to be played on the biggest screen. It will be in IMAX. And when you watch it, you're like, I'm surprised this is a movie that's meant for streaming. But again, Apple TV and Apple TV Plus, they make sure to put all the care and the love into the quality of their movies. So I really enjoyed this movie, but there are things that definitely we want to talk about.
I do really want to quickly touch on the Leonardo DiCaprio bit that you just mentioned, because it was the most recent thing you just said. When you look at Leo's run of films, I think from like 2010, of like Shutter Island, Inception, J. Edgar, Django, Great Gatsby, Wolf of Wall Street, The Revenant. Like you could tell, and even after that with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, that you could tell that he was going for a little bit more of those unique roles, that he had to give a little bit something different to it. Where I think throughout this film, Leo has that performance that we maybe have seen from him before, where he has like this kind of just stoic elegance to him. I think that's how I would describe a lot of Killers of the Flower Moon, where it's like there's this stoic elegance to the entire film, where Leo is just kind of there going around it. He's not doing anything like substantial in terms of how he's acting. He's just feels like a character in that time. And I think that's what lends itself well to his performance, but it also doesn't make it anything remarkable or extraordinary or a standout in a film that I think the subject matter itself, I think the story itself, and I think Lily Gladstone's performance is what shines throughout this film. Anthony, I would love for you to jump in because you have a very interesting perspective, one that Shay and I don't have, that you did read the book from David Grann. So I'm curious how you felt coming into Killers of the Flower Moon, knowing the story, knowing how the book is, paced, and how that was adapted to the screen, because I think this did very much feel like a novel adapted to the screen, because there's a lot of voiceover, there's a lot of moments that feel like time progressing in a novel. But I'd love for you to share your perspective, so please jump on in.
The Martin Scorsese's approach to this story is a lot different than David's approach, where David was really focusing on the murder and then having the surrounding elements about Osage and the natives and everything else kind of surrounded. While Martin Scorsese's approach is very much, this is a relationship story between Ernest and Molly. So, but there is this murder as well. So they have the same themes. It's just how Martin kind of attacks it in a sense. So I know that Martin kind of wanted to tell the story between those two characters, and he wanted to give them the limelight in a sense to understand their dynamics. But where David his book kind of tells a story about that murder, the murder of Anna Brown, which is really, really driven, because the story also focuses on the FBI and a bunch of other stuff. So there's a lot of different characters, a lot of different story lanes that it goes down, rather than Martin's real big focus on the relationship of this husband and wife. And, Martin Scorsese, I enjoy his films. I love his films. Like, he's Italian, so what do you expect from me? I'm going to support him. But like, he's been in the news quite a bit this week because he's been doing his press stuff, and he's talking about Marvel movies and all that and this and that. And it's strange because I find that Martin Scorsese has a real issue with his pacing and his storytelling for the past 3 years, really, or 4 years.
Or I would say 3 or 4 films, right? You look at, Wolf of Wall Street, Silence, Irishman, and Killers of the Flower Moon, all films that are either 3 hours or 3 hours plus.
Yes, and they're very long. They're very drawn out. They don't know when to exit. And when they do exit, they have a really good ending. But then to get to that ending, it was very much of a long adventure. And in this story, I do think that the movie is an important story. It's something that a lot of people don't know about, and I think that's where I would suggest, yes, you need to watch this film and understand the horrors and the exploitation of these natives that were happening during a time. And it kind of reminds me of the Tulsa massacre. Is a story that nobody knew about, and I didn't know about. Again, it's not my personal history. It's not Canadian history, but it's a story that I learned through The Watchmen, like the TV series. I didn't know about this. And then when I heard about Martin Scorsese and Leonardo...
But Anthony, sorry to interrupt. The fact that a lot of Americans also didn't know about that. So like us, like a lot of people learned it, which is crazy to think. A lot of people learned about the Tulsa incident for the first time watching Watchmen. That's where a lot of people had that brought to their attention. So there's a lot of history, even Canadian history, that we don't know about. And obviously we've heard with the residential schools and everything that's been coming out a lot more in recent years. It's like there's so much that we don't know, and it's not until like these type of stories come up that we're like, holy shit, like this is going on in the world. This is happening.
Yeah, no, it's something that when I learned about it, when I heard that Martin Scorsese and Leonardo DiCaprio, bought the rights, this was a long time ago. This was, I think, 2018 when they wanted to make this film, and it took a really long time to make this film. I dived into the book and I'm like, okay, I need to know what is happening, what the story is about. And it's absolutely wild, like to understand, to have this community of natives who struck oil and became like millionaires overnight, and just how they've been really like used. Even though they were super rich, they were also still controlled and still abused, and the murders that were happening because the whole town colluded around killing them off so they can take their wealth. That's just pretty much that's like some fucked up shit. And I was just, that part of this movie or this story is so important for people to know, and that's why I really want people to watch it in that sense. I think performance wise, there's nothing in this movie that really drives home performance other than Lily Gladstone as Molly, because she has she goes through the pain and suffering of Molly, who goes through a tremendous amount of hurt in her life, and in her short life too. Like, she didn't really live a long life, truthfully, and just everything that's happened to her, all like really all that pain was seen on her face. I think Lily Gladstone did a fantastic job of playing Molly as a character, because when I read the book, I understood her pain, and I could see it in her face. Like, you can literally see everything that's happening to her. Her whole world is crashing down, and Lily does a fantastic job of taking that pain and showing it on the screen. But other than that, the performances, even Robert De Niro kind of had like this Cape Fear vibe to him. Like, he had the Cape Fear accent that he kind of was portraying. Yeah. Even Leonardo DiCaprio, he played his Once Upon a Time, has like kind of like a Southern draw to his voice, like things that we've heard before. The biggest complaint is I feel like Leonardo DiCaprio is too much in this movie. And I know that Martin Scorsese, he worked with the Osage people on this. He went back because he had the story. I'm pretty sure he was going to approach this story very much like the book, but he went to the Osage people and he worked with them, and that's where he came across the story. But I find that Martin Scorsese, even though he's saying this is an important story, spent too much time on Ernest and not enough time on Molly. And I find that because it was a Leonardo DiCaprio, Martin Scorsese film, that was the precedent of making this movie an important story. It's not that this was an actual story about natives who are being abused and who are being used, and an important story in American history. They'll tie that in 100%, but it is a Leonardo DiCaprio, Martin Scorsese venture. And you see it, you feel it. He's in this movie quite a bit. Like, when I was reading the book, Ernest is not as in this book as much as he is in this movie. Like, from beginning to end, I don't think I saw a scene without him in it. And I'm trying, like, he is predominantly there. And that's where the movie has like this double-edged sword for me, where it's like, it's bringing light the story of this important factual historic event, but it's also exploiting it in a way by twisting it and telling it with Leo's perspective. And I was just like, I'm not a big fan of it. Other than that, like, I think set design, production design looks very, very good. Like, the costumes, the whole aesthetic. There's a lot of really good sequences that were shot with slow motion. There's a part in the trailer that you see where the natives hit oil, and it's all shot in slow motion. Things like that really work well. But again, I wasn't blown away by the cinematography of the film. I think that the whole idea of this movie, if I can eliminate the actors and just really focus on the story, this is such an important story to know about. And then I wonder how people interpret it, if they'll kind of dive into it a little bit more and how they approach it. Because just like the Tulsa massacre, once you knew about it, it became this huge thing and people were talking about it, and it was an important factor to a lot of causes after that. But yeah, this is something that I'm very interested to see how people will interpret it and approach it in the future, and what they'll do with it, because again, it's a story that a lot of people don't know about.
What's fascinating as well too, when you look at this time in history, is that you have these people, these Osage people, who are literal millionaires who have all this money, but they still had to have conservatorships. They still had guardians. And there's parts in this movie where they make light of it, obviously not light of it, but more like this is what's accepted at the time, where it's like they could be out in public, they could be at a bank, but you have to have like a white person there with you. And it's wild to it's so crazy to think that like this is, within the last 100 years, right? It's like, we're not like 100 years is a good amount of time, but it's not like far removed. This isn't like hundreds of years. This is within the span of 100 years, and this is still things that, again, like I said earlier, with the residential schools in Canada and things like that, that we're still hearing stories about the mistreatment and the abuse and the killing of Indigenous people. And it's crazy to think that this is still something we're experiencing today. We're still hearing about today. And I think Martin Scorsese directed an absolutely beautiful film, a very harrowing film about it. But like Shay said and like Anthony said, that it is not without its issues. And I think the biggest issue that I came away with this film, before I talk about what I loved about it, was the length. And I know we're adapting a book. I know there's a lot to cover. But when you have a film that's 3 hours and 26 minutes long, I think there's a lot there that you can trim and condense down and maybe remove, because like Anthony said, there was a lot of Leonardo DiCaprio in this film, and I wanted a lot more Molly in this film because she is such a strong character. She's such an interesting character, and anytime she's on screen, you are just magnetized to her. You are just drawn to her and to her story and to her performance. So when the last third of this film happens and she kind of gets sidelined, you really do miss her, and you miss her presence in the film. When you're looking at, again, like we were talking about the last 4 Scorsese films, this feels a lot more in line with Silence, like The Irishman, where Scorsese is taking the time that he's given, and he's just like, you know what, I'm at a point that he's 82 years old, he's 80 plus now. Scorsese's like, I am just going to make the films that I want. I'm going to make them the lengths that I want, and I love that he's been able to partner with people like Apple, like Netflix, to bring these stories, uncompromised vision to life, and that's great. And I think what Killers of the Flower Moon does best is telling a story that I think is so important and also really well told, and setting that or establishing the time frame and the look and the feel. There's such a beauty to this film, but it's also surrounded by just such sorrow and pain and just horrors. And I think you look at Lily's performance in this film. She is the star of this movie, and again, I wish she was given some more time. Scorsese, obviously one of the greatest living filmmakers with us still to this day. And seeing him in the news and seeing him talk about, like, if I'm just allotted a couple more films, it's wild to think that there's going to be a time where he's not going to be with us, right? And that's really scary to think of as well too. But nobody, I think there's 2 people in this world that I think whenever a film is theirs, and I think it's Spielberg and it's Scorsese, and Nolan's obviously up there, but there's a way that Scorsese moves the camera, and I think Killers of the Flower Moon is just filled with these moments where you're just like, no one can move a camera like Scorsese does, and like you're just in that moment. You're either going through a crowd of people or you're panning around to a vista. There's something that Scorsese does that is just unapologetically his.
I think whenever we've watched any Scorsese film from the beginning till now, he has a way to normalize the violence that we're kind of seeing in the movies, where it's brutal violence. That is exactly it. It's brutal, but the way he does it is so nonchalant in a way that you're like, did anyone else just see what happened? Like, why are they glossing over that? And it's so intentional. It's literally like, this is society. It'll move on. It'll happen like this. And then people move from it. It's terrifying. And I think he does a fantastic job of that. But again, that's nothing new to Scorsese. This isn't a reinvention of the director. This is continuing the legacy that he's always had.
The violence in this film is a lot more timid compared to his other productions that he's done, where they actually
spaced out. I felt
it's spaced out, but they're not as brutal as I thought it would be.
I mean, I think it all depends. I think on your, on your level of comfortability maybe with it too.
You can stomach, I guess,
because I think the moments that are highlighted are like difficult to watch. Like this movie, Killers of the Flower Moon, isn't an easy watch, and that's not just because of length. It's the subject matter. It is heavy. You're going to feel every moment of this film, and when it's highlighted with violence. But 100%, Anthony, when you look at you look at other films that Scorsese has done where it's just been like
Casino,
a bloodbath, Casino, Goodfellas. It's not like that. So I think what this movie does is that it lures you into this almost area of like where you're comfortable watching a drama, and then it just highlights these moments of violence where you're just like, oh my God, that person was just shot in the head, or this person was just brutally beaten, and it lingers with you, and that stays with you, and you feel the weight of that.
It's kind of like that scene that you told me about. No spoilers, obviously, but it reminded you, and I think it reminded me. I'm not sure if it reminded you, Anthony. Kind of the Zodiac, like Zodiac from David Fincher. Like there's this moment where we're like, oh wow, like that. The way that scene just occurred, it really reminded me of that. There's another movie that this movie kind of reminded me of, and it reminded me of the good of that movie and also the bad of that movie. And it was a notoriously panned film, and that's Live by Night by director Ben Affleck. There's a lot of moments in this movie that kind of actually just reminded me of that movie. Like some of the moments where I'm like, oh, I'm not like, this isn't a great scene. It reminded me of those not so great scenes from that film, and then vice versa. It felt very like similar to me, at least.
Yeah, no, I definitely see the connection between those two films, because the time period is also not that far removed either. So
there's another film that it reminded me of, and it hit on it, but it never really went with it. And again, it was a story approach that I felt like if they did tell, it would have been much longer. But it's a story that that is important because it's focused on the book, and that's the FBI section of this movie. And it really reminded me of The Untouchables, because when you bring in Jesse Plemons and his group of FBI guys, they all have like this aura to them that they're going to catch whoever's doing this, and they are going to bring to justice the murders that are happening. And their cowboyness of like approach to this story, I wish we saw more of it, because in the book they really dive into the investigation part. And again, this is a story that has a different approach. But if you ever read the book, they're like badass, FBI guys. And this is really the start of the FBI. And when Jesse Plemons is brought onto the screen, you just feel like, oh boy, like he is on a journey to get whoever's killing. And
Jesse Plemons, he has such a presence in all of his films. And I've been rewatching Breaking Bad, and I just been like, man, I can't wait to get to his episodes, because he just has like he just there's something to his performances that you're just like, I just want to see what this guy does. I want more of him. And I would have loved to know more about, the FBI side of things. I'm glad that it focused on the Osage Nation, but there's another story there that I think got a little bit short-ended with the FBI story, that I think there could have been a lot more to it. But like Oppenheimer and like a lot of other films, this film has inspired me that I want to go back and learn more about what went on here and see how this is different, see how this is accurate. But there's a lot of story in this. There's a lot of story in this film.
One thing I do want to bring to mind is, I watched a lot of documentaries on Oppenheimer, and whenever I went to go watch Oppenheimer and how Christopher Nolan told that story, that guy got everything about Oppenheimer's character, his life, all captured in 3 hours. And the way he taught it and told it, it really, really brings to mind all the things that I watched in terms of the documentaries leading up to this. And I felt that when I was watching, Killers, the approach that Martin had on it and the editing became such a long-winded process that I lost the emotional connection I had with Molly, with the Osage Indians, and with, at the end of the justice that was supposed to happen and the injustice that happens. And I feel like that approach just kind of was swirled in there, and it never really hit as hard as what I got from Oppenheimer, which was this story that was elegantly edited and fluidly told, and the score was fantastic, and it really hit the emotional notes that Killers cannot do. And that's my opinion. I know that, but like that's just how I felt when I kind of got into it, because I should have felt more at the end, and I didn't.
No, I think you're absolutely right there, Anthony. And you talk about the length of this movie, and I know that one of the things that when we left the film we discussed was really and it's almost like a game that we play with every movie we watch, like how long could this movie have actually been? And I think we talked about, okay, you 100% could have done it within 3 hours, but if we're being generous, 245 max, and you would have been able to tell a much more tight-knit story. You would have gotten anything out of the way, and you could have also probably introduced some stuff earlier, because you're cutting out a lot of this chunk that might have been from the beginning that maybe was kind of dragging its feet into getting, because what the movie really feels like is it really takes that first 2 hours, maybe even a little bit more, and it's just kind of like one thorough story, and then it feels like, oh, we got to wrap this up, so let's kind of just push everything that we possibly can into it. Last thing I'll say before, if you guys want to touch on that, is I remember bringing up the score to you, Daniel, when we were watching the movie, and I really loved the opening score in this movie. And then as you were kind of talking to me about it after, you're like, yeah, there was a great score, but did you feel like it wasn't there often, or if, when it was there, it was just kind of like the same three notes? And I'm like,
yeah, it'd be like the bass line. I was like,
yeah,
dum,
you're kind of right there,
dum,
right? And like
yeah.
exactly that. Like it's nice to hear it in the beginning and in the moments that it comes in. There is one piece of music though that felt super out of nowhere, like it did not match the vibe of the scene at all.
The Ted Lasso music.
The Ted Lasso music, exactly.
Yeah, there's a sequence that it definitely felt. And Robbie Robertson did the score for rest in peace to him, who's a Canadian from Toronto. Worked on the score for this film. He just died just previous August. We remember hearing about that. But there's some great music in this film. But I just wish that, like Shay was saying, yeah, definitely, I wish there was used a little bit more, or there's a little bit more variation. And again, I'm not too sure what Martin decided was like, we don't want to change or we don't want to alter to respect, Robbie, of course. But there's a lot there. Was there something else you wanted to touch on, Shay?
No, that's it. That's perfect.
The other thing I want to talk about, the cinematography, I did talk about it a little bit earlier. The cinematographer who worked on this film is Rodrigo Prieto, who obviously Scorsese has worked with multiple times in the past. The Irishman, Silence, Wolf of Wall Street. He also worked on Argo. But also, funny enough, we spoke about this earlier this year, also the cinematographer for Barbie. So 2 big films for Rodrigo this year, which is very funny to see how different these 2 films are. But just to comment on the length of this film one more time, I do think that if the film was a little bit shorter, it would have given, I think, Molly's story a little bit more of a through line, because we are in the perspective of Leonardo DiCaprio for so long in this, and because he is not a great person in this movie. You do feel like, I'm like, wow, we're giving him a lot of the spotlight. So you almost get tricked into thinking, I'm like, oh, he's not doing anything wrong. And then it's not that you're like, oh no, hold on, he is not a good person. He is not the hero of the story at all. So like, obviously I think there was a lot more room to, include Molly's story and the Osage people more and throughout this. But Shay, please.
Yeah, I was just going to quickly touch upon the screenplay for the movie as well. Like I know this is it's written by Martin Scorsese, then you have David Grann, and who I believe wrote the book, as I recall, Anthony. You have Eric Roth, who is one of the writers, and I think this is I could be wrong, but this is his first time working with Eric Roth, and Eric has quite the list of films. You have Dune, Star is Born, Extremely Loud and Close, Curious Case of Benjamin Button, Good Shepherd, Munich, Ali, Forrest Gump. So
a lot of long movies,
a lot of long movies,
very
but a
long
lot
movies.
of like just like a critically acclaimed, and of course just pieces of cinema that everybody knows. So
yeah,
this is going to be, I think, another notch on Eric's belt here, because this movie will still be critically acclaimed and it'll still do well with people who love Scorsese and love these people. So there's no doubt about that. So that's really interesting to see that, this is Scorsese's, I guess, first time working with him. I could be wrong, but from what it looks like, it is.
I love it. Let's get to our final recommendation. Shahbaz, I'm going to get you to start us off.
Absolutely. Killers of the Flower Moon. It is a long film. It is a beautiful film. It is a powerful film. And like Anthony and Daniel have mentioned so far, a very important film as well. This is an interesting kind of suggestion to give, because this is a movie that is meant for streaming in the sense that it is released by a streamer, but it will be released in theaters and in IMAX as well. I would love for people to go watch this in theaters because it's a beautiful film. It is long, but it's beautiful and very powerful. But if you can't see it there, definitely do watch it at home. So I would say watch it, whether at home or whether in theaters. If you can take that 3 hours and 26 minutes, go to a theater. If you think, hey, I'd rather be at home to watch it, pause it, take a pee break every couple minutes, then maybe watch it at home. But definitely do go watch it.
Yeah, and also consult your doctor if you're going to go pee every couple minutes, because that is
how many times did we go to the watch? I felt like we went a lot.
I went to go pee. No, I didn't go pee at all, actually.
Interesting. I just felt like I must have gotten up quite a bit. Because it is a
People
long
were getting up, though. People were getting
film.
up.
It's a very long
People
film.
were going to watch it for sure. I'm going to go next. I'm right there with Shay. I think this is watch it. It's worth your time. We need movies like this to come to theaters, like Scorsese is saying. Like, we need to support movies like this so we could get more movies like this made. It's funny that it's like Scorsese is one of the most known directors, and it's like even he is like, it's not easy to get movies made. We need to get movies made. So definitely go support this film. I really did love it. There is a long, I think it is a long film, as we've said, and I think that's my biggest takeaway with this film is that, you know, if it was literally a good 30 minutes shorter, 30, 40 minutes shorter, I think it would have been a phenomenal, tight script. But luckily, if you're not able to watch it in the theater, you can watch it at home. You can pause it, and you could experience it that way. But no matter how you experience it, make sure you experience it, because Killers of the Flower Moon is definitely worth your time. Anthony, take us home.
It's also a watch it for me, even though I don't think it's the best approach for this film. And I think Martin Scorsese kind of gets in the way with his own likeness, in a sense, like his own identity of who he is. It kind of overshadows a lot of the story. And I don't know if you find that with a director who's so big and so, you know, accredited, and even with Leonardo
Tarantino's
DiCaprio
up there too, right? That they're his own, or Wes Anderson. There's directors that their own approach to things can impede their approach to things, right?
Right, and that's maybe why we get the story of the length of the story and maybe the approach to the story. But I do think it's an important story. I think you will learn something, and you will be interested to learn more, and probably dive into the history of the Osage Nation and kind of get an idea of where they are now and how this affected them for many, many years after. But yeah, it's a watch it. I wish I could say it's a real gem. I really do. But again, it all comes down to the approach, and I find that one thing that I wish they kind of dived in a little bit about was why they call it the Killers of the Flower Moon, and how it's in conjunction with the story of these flowers that are bloomed on the valleys of the Osage
they
hills,
just kind of glossed over it.
Yeah,
really glossed over. But if you really look at it, these beautiful flowers are like the natives that kind of live there, and why they call it the Killer of the Flower Moon is because during these times, these peak times where there's these huge moons, other plants and trees grow, and they kind of like suffocate these flowers, which could be, you know, the colonialization that was happening at that time, and how we killed them off in a sense. And I wish that was like mentioned and maybe put into it, because Martin Scorsese had his own approach to that ending, but I feel like that's an important part of that story, why they call it Killers of the Flower Moon.
I love that. And I do want to say, again, without spoilers, and again, we know this is based on the book, we know this is based on history, there's a choice how this film is presented at the end that made me a little bit more emotional, and I think there's a lot to unpackage from that. But again, I don't want to give anything away for if people have watched it. It is something that we will be talking about, though, on our Discord, in future videos, in future episodes of the MUBI Podcast. So make sure, if you liked our discussion today, make sure you're following us on all podcast feeds, on YouTube, on social media platforms at the MUBI Podcast. There is so much to look forward to. There's so much coming, especially in October, so you don't want to miss any of it. There's a lot more that we're going to be talking about with this film, and another huge Apple film coming out later this year with Napoleon, which is, again, sure to be another massive 3-hour probably plus epic, but we can't wait for it. There's so much to look forward to, and what Apple is putting out, I think they're making some really great decisions. If you do want to watch Killers of the Flower Moon in theaters, it will be available on October 20th with an Apple TV Plus release date at a later date. So we don't have a date for that yet, so go watch it in theaters. This is the MUBI Podcast. Like I said, so much to look forward to, so much coming your way. Make sure you're following us on all social media platforms and on all podcast feeds. That was this time with the MUBI Podcast, and we'll see you next.